Thank you, Nam, I guess. I have no idea who Nam is talking about, but thank you nonetheless. Vietnam is a paradox. I'm going to sit here. I know sometimes people stand, but I'm just going to sit here. Vietnam is a paradox, a remarkably vibrant place. Any of you who've gone to Vietnam understand the vibrancy and energy of Vietnam. We all love going to Vietnam, those of us who have the ability to do that. Remarkably active economy, some problems of course, but a very active economy, and a very active society. But it's also a paradox because it is still a single-party directed state, and it's a single-party directed state that in the past, particularly 4 or 5 years, although there are waves of this repression that go back many decades, in the past 4 or 5 years has really engaged in a comprehensive, systematic, as I say here, crackdown on dissent and civil society. It is a pleasure being back here, as Nam mentions, and I think Mary may have mentioned before. I've been on leave, coming back and forth, but primarily on leave in New York with a grandbaby for several years during and after COVID. I'll be back here next year, so I look forward to coming back to Friday Forum events next year. But it's a great pleasure seeing old friends, some of whom I haven't seen for a while. Mary, Nam, my old friend from the Library of Congress in New Delhi, that goes back a long way. Catherine, Mike, Larry, Terrell, and others that I'm not mentioning. So it's a pleasure being back here. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about 3 developments in Vietnam that relate to this theme of the crackdown on dissent and civil society. One is perhaps the most well-known because it's gotten quite a bit of attention in the human rights community and beyond, which is the arrests and convictions of civil society activists and dissidents in Vietnam, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years. Then I'll talk a bit, very briefly, about the political and regulatory means that have been used to restrict the role of nonprofit organizations and civil society organizations in Vietnam. And then I'll talk a little bit about something closely related to that, which is a new party move to what we call in Vietnam and China, securitized society in Vietnam, which is to make Vietnamese society more responsive to the security concerns of security agencies, which are very powerful, not only in Vietnam, but also in China and other countries. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, including a new development on that over the past year. But first, the question of arrests and convictions of civil society activists and dissidents. Some of the people who've been taken over the past 4 or 5 years in Vietnam, most but not all of them arrested and then convicted. Some of them are true political dissidents, but not all of them are. And that's one of the paradoxes of the current situation in Vietnam. Some who've been taken are political dissidents whose probably personal preference might be to see a different political system in Vietnam. But others are people who have sought to work within the system on climate change, on environment, on the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, and other relatively establishment topics on which the Vietnamese Communist Party and the Vietnamese state have themselves also committed to work on. And that is something of a contradiction because in some cases, these are prominent people who have worked with the government before, but in the much more restrictive, securitized environment of the past 4 or 5 years, have found themselves crossing red lines and on the outside of what's permissible, and therefore arrested, detained, and sometimes tried and convicted of crimes in Vietnam. Most of those have been climate change and environment, policy people, dissidents, or activists. They're not always people who work on climate change and environment, but that may be among the biggest clusters of those that the security agencies in Vietnam have targeted over the past 4 or 5 years. There are others who've worked on freedom of expression, literature, poetry, art, who found themselves in trouble with the authorities. There's at least one, as I say here, a leading legal reformer, legal critic, who happens to be an old friend who I've known for, 20 years? ran an organization called Policy, Law, and Development in Hanoi and found himself detained and still under arrest in Hanoi as of last year. We have many examples. The most well-known example, because of her affiliation with President Obama and the Obama Foundation, is Huang Ti-Min-Hung, the founder of a network NGO called Change, which was shut down in 2022 when the initial arrests of some of the environment and climate change activists came to light. She decided to close down her organization, in part to protect their employees and those they worked with. It did not save her. She was arrested in late 2022, early 2023, and then last year, as I say here, convicted of tax evasion, which is a common charge used against civil society activists, policy activists, and dissenters in Vietnam, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The most well-known group here is the original group of environment and climate change policy analysts and dissidents and civil society activists who were arrested in 2021-2022. They're called by the somewhat awkward term, the Vietnam Four. I've put their names up here for anyone who wants to look them up. One of them, Nguyen Thi Khien, who I had the privilege of meeting, I think just once, maybe twice, I think just once, a number of years ago, was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize some years back. This is a very distinguished group. And again, one of the paradoxes is that most of these people have worked with the state in one capacity or another in earlier years to address the issues of climate change and environmental degradation in Vietnam. But the political moment has changed in Vietnam, and they have moved from being, in effect, more liberal critics, constructive critics, those who work on policy alternatives, to being regarded as threats. And so they've been taken, and in most cases, arrested. The focus has been on networks. Networks as well as individual non-governmental organizations. Networks such as the Open Government Project, which began some years ago in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, and the European-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement network of domestic NGOs. The Vietnamese government, particularly the security side of the Vietnamese government, is particularly concerned not only about individual NGO organizations that work on policy alternatives, but also on networks forming among NGOs. This is a concern throughout Asia, whether we're talking about China, whether we're talking about India, other places. The state sometimes feels more confident in its ability to control the work of individual activists and individual organizations. Sometimes when they step in, it's when organizations begin to come together across functional issues like climate change or the environment or other issues. That's certainly the case in Vietnam beginning in 2021 and 2022, as these networks, such as the Open Government Project and the European Union Vietnam Free Trade Agreement network of domestic NGOs, as they came together, bringing groups together, the state descended. And as a result, most of these networks have now collapsed in Vietnam. There are other networks, interestingly, including at least one network whose advisory board I was on for a number of years. There are other networks of domestic NGOs, particularly in the southern part of Vietnam, that have not particularly worked on environment or climate change. They've really worked on social services in Ho Chi Minh City, in Saigon. Those networks of small NGOs got very scared, beginning in 2021, 2022, as this began happening to the environmental climate change types of groups. And so we have seen several relatively broad networks of non-political, relatively non-controversial, small groups in Saigon particularly, actively seeking to close down to avoid trouble from the authorities in the wake of the closing of some other networks that were more focused on controversial issues, such as climate change, such as the environment. You might ask, Why would the Vietnamese state target networks of organizations focusing on climate change and the environment? And this is something about a sort of hotly debated topic in the non-governmental community in Vietnam, and there appear to be a number of overlapping answers. One is that the intellectuals and activists who were leading figures in many of these groups, some of whose names are on here, and who formed some of these networks, were particularly active in criticizing the expansion of coal-fired plants in Vietnam. The coal industry is a major industry in Vietnam, as either you know or you can imagine. And those who criticize a continued reliance on coal and a continued reliance on building coal plants can find themselves in some difficulty with the authorities, and that clearly has happened. Beyond that, a number of these figures, who began as relatively establishment figures in Vietnam, viewed it as something akin to a right to participate in policy discussions. And NGO leaders participating in policy discussions in Vietnam have to do that very, very carefully. There are channels in which that can occur, but on controversial topics such as coal-fired plants or climate change policy, it can go awry. And it seems to have gone awry quite quickly as the red lines changed for a number of these policy analysts, intellectuals, activists, and others. So that's a very broad picture of some of the crackdown in the past 4 or 5 years. That crackdown is continuing. We've seen a number of recent arrests. People tend to languish in jail for a year to a year and a half before they're brought to trial. Not everyone is brought to trial. It can be very difficult to figure out who's going to be brought to trial, who's not going to be brought to trial. But this does appear to be continuing. A second theme, but also related, has to do with the broader attempt to restrict and control civil society in Vietnam. This primarily happens through legal means. We have a variety of legal means that are used to restrict the ability of non-governmental organizations of various kinds to form, to register, to conduct a wide range of activities, to fundraise, to go out and conduct public programs. These are all restricted activities in Vietnam, and they have become more restricted in recent years. I mentioned just a couple of the key elements here. Decrees published in 2020 and 2022 that have continued to restrict the ability of non-governmental organizations of various kinds, societies, including social enterprises in some cases, clubs, groups of intellectuals, etc., to register and conduct their activities. And there has been also a further restriction. These tend to go together in places like Vietnam and China, a further restriction on the activities that are available to foreign NGOs in Vietnam as well. Groups like Save the Children, CARE, Oxfam, etc. To the point that some of the foreign organizations under Decree 58 in 2022 have had such a hard time with getting approval for some of their activities that they have begun to quietly question whether they should remain in Vietnam, some roughly 50 years after the war, when they remained in Vietnam in some cases, CARE, Save the Children, the Quakers, Bread for the World, and a number of others. They've remained in Vietnam the entire time since 1975, and have now begun to quietly question whether there's enough space, enough room in Vietnam for them to carry out activities, or whether they should move to countries where they are more able to carry out activities and where there is perhaps more or even more poverty than there is in Vietnam at this point. That's a really important question for the so-called INGOs, international NGOs, what to do about closing civic space and at the same time the relative prosperity of some countries like Vietnam, and when it's time to leave and move elsewhere. But the closing of civic space for international NGOs has prompted that discussion. We've also seen a number of actions by the Vietnamese government against both domestic organizations, which I mentioned in the first part, and very occasionally against foreign organizations as well. Foreign NGOs operating in Vietnam tend not to have actions taken against them. They just tend to find on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis a slowdown in approvals so that they are unable to carry out a range of the activities for which they've been funded to do, or just find it very difficult to conduct new activities around Vietnam. One particular action taken against a specific organization was an action taken several years ago to try to close the Vietnamese branch of an organization called Transparency International, which some of you have heard of because it's the main international anti-corruption NGO based in Germany with branches and organizations around the world. The Vietnamese Communist Party is engaged in an anti-corruption drive of its own that perhaps those of you who work on Vietnam have heard about, and has relatively little interest in having parallel NGOs working on issues of anti-corruption in Vietnam. And so attempts were made several years ago, they were successful attempts, to find ways to close the Vietnamese office of Transparency International, which was called Towards Transparency. I've been working in Vietnam long enough that I remember when Towards Transparency was created about 20 years ago. And it was a major event in Vietnam that an anti-corruption domestic NGO could start in Vietnam. But that was a different political time. And now the Vietnamese state itself engaged in a anti-corruption drive that has political elements as well, doesn't see much need to have domestic anti-corruption organization. Third, in a few minutes I'm going to stop and open it up for questions, is the question of recent attempts to broaden what we sometimes call the securitization of society. This is something that has been happening in China now for many years, certainly during the Xi Jinping administration in China, which began in 2012. The growth and power of the security agencies, a wide variety of security agencies, both in China and Vietnam. Vietnam, as is sometimes the case, lagged several years on some Chinese policies. China began this securitization, giving policy to the security agencies and injecting a security lens over almost all policy making in the country. China began that really in 2012, 2013, 2014. Vietnam has been doing that, but to some degree as a lesser extent. Last summer, however, the Vietnamese Communist Party's political bureau, which is the highest group within the Vietnamese Communist Party, published initially a confidential party document, which rapidly became public because it was explained to party organizations throughout the country, which really was a sort of guide to the securitization of Vietnamese society. And I put here just a few of the areas in which the Communist Party indicated in July of 2023 that they wanted to see more of a security lens over policymaking and decisions taken by state entities in Vietnam. Restrictions on international travel by sensitive personnel, further restrictions on independent political organizations, that's already in effect been stamped out. Further restrictions on labor organizations, including labor organizations that are formed on the basis of ethnicity or religion, and further steps to build the official Vietnamese trade union, the Vietnamese Confederation of Labor, General Confederation of Labor. Strengthen party leadership over labor units, especially as Vietnam comes under criticism from Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and others on the ILO convention that relates to the rights to organize and freedom of association, and a new focus on foreign NGOs in Vietnam, domestic NGOs of all kind, stricter management of international cooperation activities, and just go down to the second page. closely integrating economic, cultural, and social and foreign affairs with defense and security. This has been happening in China now for a number of years. I quote from the document, closely integrating economic, cultural, social, and foreign affairs with defense and security, because that's exactly what's happened in China during the Xi Jinping administration. There is a security lens over virtually all policy decisions in China, and that can have chilling effects. If any of you have been thinking, probably not, but if any of you have been thinking about research in China, the security lens over research approvals in China means that it is currently, as some of you know, very difficult to conduct certain kinds of research in China, particularly research at the grassroots level or in archives, and a variety of other security concerns in China. This is now happening in Vietnam as well. We don't know exactly how far it's going to go, but the securitization of policy and the securitization of work with non-governmental organizations and policy research institutes and foreign academics is clearly going to be a wider lens, a more applied lens in Vietnam than it may have been in the past. So these three developments are interlocking developments. I don't think you'd get a lot of pushback from representatives of the Vietnamese party and state that these are occurring. Their perspective on it might be different than my perspective on it, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of pushback on the facts that this is occurring. Increasing pressure on civil society and intellectual activists, dissenters, policy researchers, increasing legal and regulatory pressure on the non-governmental community, both domestic and foreign, and an increasing securitization of Vietnamese society, not started by the document next year, but clearly enhanced by the document that was issued last year. One of the groups, for those who are interested in more information on this than I have in this brief outline, one of the groups that has worked on this and has produced a series of really terrific reports on all three aspects of this is a group called Project 88, which is a very small group of researchers based in Bangkok, led by one or two people that I've been in touch with regularly, who have produced a series of reports, as I said, on all three of these aspects, including a report just last week or 2 weeks ago on this Directive 24 on securitization. So if you're interested in more, going to the Project 88 website, I think it's called 88project.com, will show you those reports, including much more information on the civil society activists who've been arrested, on the legal means used to restrict civil society, and on the securitization agenda, which is now more of a policy agenda. So just a couple questions or issues, and then I'm going to stop. The comparisons with China are natural comparisons. That is not to say that Vietnam follows China in all things. That is not the case by any means. But at least with respect to the securitization of society and restrictions on the NGO and in some cases dissident community, Vietnam and China show certain parallels. Whether the securitization agenda in Vietnam will go as far as it has in China, where it's gone very far, is hard to know at this point. And it's one of the questions that those of us who try to watch this carefully between Vietnam and China will be asking. We're also asking, in part because some of us who work on this have many friends in Vietnam, both in the Vietnamese community and the foreign community. We're also asking about the differential effects of these kinds of restrictive policies on different kinds of non-governmental groups in Vietnam. These policies are perhaps least likely to have the most damaging effects on local groups that focus on social services. Local groups that focus on social services in both Vietnam and China do retain some significant capacity to carry out their work. They are non-political groups. They are not engaged generally in issues like climate change. They're not working with the European Union climate change community. They're not receiving funding from abroad. They tend to be small groups that are doing what the state, both in Vietnam and in China, but here we're talking about Vietnam, that are doing what the state wants them to do, which is to conduct social services at the local level. National groups, on the other hand, even the ones that focus on social services, are under much more scrutiny from the state in Vietnam these days. And groups in particular fields, as I've indicated, environment, climate change, some freedom of expression groups, some legal reform groups, not all. If you're in particular functional fields, the Vietnamese party and state is very good at calibrating the fields in which to show restrictive interest. So if you're working on, as a national group, on school lunch programs for kids with domestic funding from Vietnamese companies and charitable groups, maybe even some overseas Vietnamese, you're likely to be just fine. That is something the state wants to occur. If you're a Vietnamese national group working on policy interventions, especially if you have foreign funding from Western Europe or the US or Canada or Australia, and you're working on climate change, or you're working on the environment, or you're working on particularly aggressive forms of legal reform, things like that, you're going to attract more surveillance from the state. And networks are a problem, and that has been shown repeatedly in Vietnam over the past 4, 5, 6 years. Even networks of social service groups providing social services to citizens during and after COVID, which are fundamentally non-political, have attracted close scrutiny from the authorities. And again, that's not surprising. In Vietnam and many other countries, when individual, largely powerless groups come together in networks, the state becomes more interested in that because potentially their legitimacy and authority may begin to grow. As I said before, there are some increasing questions for overseas NGOs operating in Vietnam. We're going to have to see how those play out. There's a long and really very positive history of the international NGOs working in Vietnam, going back to 1975, and in some cases, both in the South and in the North, before 1975. Everyone who works with Vietnam would be very sad to see some of those international NGOs leave Vietnam. But the recent developments have sparked some questions. The broader question, something I'm particularly interested in, is what happens with climate change and environmental work, whether it's intellectual work, research and studies that lead to helping to formulate policy, or more activist work in terms of lobbying the National Assembly in Hanoi, or other groups for changes in climate change and environmental policy. What's the future of that work in a situation in which the primary intellectuals and activists in this field have, in the past 4 or 5 years, been detained and in some cases convicted? Is there any future for work on this in Vietnam? Given the importance of these issues in Vietnam, low-lying, still dependent on coal and a variety of other areas, it's important that there be a diversity of voices in climate change and environment in Vietnam. And it is clear that there are some within the Vietnamese state who continue to agree that it's important to have a diversity of voices in this area. And we're going to have to see how this plays out, because clearly the security forces are more concerned about the diversity of voices in a negative way, and others would like to see the diversity of voices, and we don't quite know what the future of that's going to be. But it is important that there be more voices on climate change and environmental work in Vietnam. That has largely been silenced over the past 4 or 5 years, and we're going to have to see if it's going to begin to reemerge at some point. And with that, I'm going to stop and open it up to any questions from anyone, either about Vietnam or, for those who are interested, about some of the comparisons with China, if that's useful. Thank you.